Welcome back to the Energy Sovereignty Project as we close out our first week of March. We're going to have several screenshots in this episode. We're going to take you through step by step some of the things that we've learned over the last couple of months. And we're going to show how those decision points apply to an average week. And there's not much else that I can show you here at the system, so let's go ahead and get over to the studio and we'll get started. Well, welcome back to the studio as we enter our third month. Like I said, this update here is going to be a little different than the previous updates, where we're going to be applying those things that we've learned over the last 2 months, the decision points. And that's been our theme over the last couple of months, is understanding the information that, that comes in to us. And so this hopefully is a little fun for you. It's going to be a step-by-step as we go through the decision processes for this week. And that way we can examine some of the ways that battery management systems are going to need to be designed by anybody who's going to play this game going into the future. And so we'll start off by going through some of the symbols that you see in the log for those of you who've been following this along. And the important thing to remember there is that the symbols and how they equate to power output is specific to our system. Everybody's system is going to be different, and that's why AI is so important, that these systems are going to have to be able to learn what their parameters are. They're going to factor in things like what time of year it is and what the weather forecast is like. We'll get into that in a minute here. The weather forecast is obviously very important as far as predicting what is expected for the next several days. Now, again, this is going to require machine learning, right? Now, there are certain companies that are well positioned to take advantage of this. Tesla specifically. The amount of machine learning that they already have, the experience with doing that with their vehicles, is going to make something like a solar battery system a cakewalk. But it is something that all companies are going to need to hone their expertise in. And so let's start by going through some of our systems. Again, the results presented here, they're broken down into time of year. And so again, as you follow our log, a rainy day in February is going to be a very different animal than a rainy day in, say, late spring or early fall. And so that's also, you have to keep in mind that as we go through these symbols are accurate now. I would say that you could safely make the prediction within, I would say, about a 1 month window, maybe either way. 2 weeks one way, 2 weeks the other. I think that would be completely safe. And so let's start with looking at some of the symbols. So here, when you see this symbol here, this is our worst weather. We have very thick clouds, high winds, usually shown as a thunderstorm type of an activity. And the general rule is that you'll get between 4 kilowatt hours and very seldom over 10 kilowatt hours. But there are those special exceptions. There, on February the 14th, for example, it was nasty weather, but it had this freak break right in the middle of the day when we had peak production. And so we actually did wind up getting a decent amount of production on February 14th. So it does happen, but again, that's the very rare exception and not the rule. And so then we have our next stage here, where you still have very thick clouds. High winds can be present, but generally just a thick cloud layer. It's usually represented on the weather forecast as a 90 to a 100% chance of rain. And again, that has to do with the percentage of cloud cover over a given area. We'll get into that in a minute. But that will wind up producing generally between 10 and 20 kilowatt hours of production. All right? And so then the next one here is the partially sunny, where you still have that chance of rain. Clouds can be thick at times, but they're generally moving through, so you get a lot of fluctuation during the day. This is generally shown as an 80 to 90% chance of rain. Again, that symbol there with clouds and rain, and what that does is it generally gives us between 20 and 30 kilowatt hours of production. And so then we have this next one here. This is our partially sunny, partially cloudy, however you want to look at it. Again, generally in the 40 to 80% chance of rain or cloud cover. And this generally yields us between 25 and 37 kilowatt hours a day. Again, this time of year. And then finally we have our sunny days, obviously 0% to around 30% cloud cover, and that typically gives us between 35 and 45, though we're starting to push closer to that 50 kilowatt hour mark as well. And then you'll also, on that log, you'll see sometimes this symbol here, and this is the symbol for fog or a very thick haze. And I've included it in here, but we don't really have enough data points for this yet to make much of it if we see it on the forecast. So at this point, it's just kind of an interesting thing to have in and keep track of. And so here, let's pull up a forecast here and kind of dissect what's going on. So the most important thing to look at here is what you'll see on the far right. There's that percentage chance of rain. Well, for those who don't know how this works, from a true weather standpoint, the weather channels, again, they announce this as a chance of rain. And what it really represents, though, is the total amount of cloud cover in percentage over any given area. And again, these areas are split up by the areas of reporting. And so when you look at a weather forecast for your area, that's what you're seeing, is that's the percentage of cloud cover for your localized area. And though if you're looking for what likelihood are you to need your umbrella, then looking at it as a percentage of a chance of rain is fine. That works for you. But for our purpose, it's better to look at it and think of it in terms of a meteorological standpoint, where it represents the percentage of cloud cover that's going to wind up affecting your production. It's more, I think, more helpful to look at it that way. And so as you can see, as we look at the breakdown, it's pretty easy to make the predictions. So referring back to what we had just shown with the symbols, the breakdown is basically this. So that 43% is going to wind up yielding us somewhere between 25 and 37 kilowatts for that Thursday, the 28th. And then our expectation at 95 is down to 10 to 20 kilowatt hours for March 1st. And much the same, 10 to 20 for March 2nd. Sunday, March 3rd, with a 72% cloud cover, we're into that 25 to 37 kilowatt hour range, probably closer to the high end. And then finally we close out with the predicted 25 to 37 kilowatts on the 4th. But that's pretty far out. Generally, the system would continually monitor itself, and so as those days that are in this case far out become closer, the prediction becomes more refined, and then you kind of see that as we go here. And so let's pull up our March 1st. So here we go. Here's March 1st. So at the time of first solar contribution here, you see that we're sitting at 12%. The average daily use for the home is kind of trending between that 20-25 kilowatt hour range. And again, this is in a temperature bracket this time of year of around 60 degrees Fahrenheit for a high and 40 degrees Fahrenheit for a low. So again, very, very mild temperatures. And again, that is reflected in the total time that the heating fan, the circulating fans are going. They're just not using up all that much power. And so what we'll see here is that the expectation for the system, it's going to try and decide each day how easily we make it to a 20% charge on the system. Now, the reason the 20% number is important, again, it's related to our system and it's related to what time of year it is. And that 20% number that's the amount of charge that we need in the system so that we'll make it from when our total solar day production stops and the next day when we get our first solar contribution. And so that's pretty critical. And again, that number isn't static. That number, it pertains to this time of year. As the days get longer, that period between when the system cuts off and when it charges the next day also shrinks. And so we've already started to see a reduction. No longer really is it a solid 20%. Sometimes it's generally now ranging between that 16 to 18%. So we're already starting to see some fluctuations as the day gets longer. And so again, that 20% is it's an important part of our decision points. So what does the system do? Right? It knows it needs to make that 20%. It knows it's got a decent production day ahead of it. It doesn't do anything. We leave the system. It just leaves itself at 0% reserve, and it starts to charge. And so then what you can see here is that we hit our total solar day at 525, and the system was sitting at 24%. Expected drain of 20% overnight. And the system needs to then decide what it's going to do and makes that decision point again like we discussed at the end of the total solar day. If it leaves the percentage of reserve on anything more than 4%, then it's likely that it won't make it to the next day, and what it will do is it will start to then draw off the grid. On the other hand, if we set it to a reserve of 0, there really isn't any danger of us being involved in a power outage situation, because the system will run easily until noon or so the following day without any worry about losing power. So in this case, if we were the system, we would set our reserve to 0%, and then we'd maybe let the owner know that we did that, right? And so that's March 1st, and then well, how did we do? Well, we probably couldn't have been any closer to what we predicted. We expected 10 to 20 kilowatt hours, and the production exceeded the upper end of that slightly. And so then the system runs off battery power until morning, when we would expect to see a percentage the following day of somewhere around 4%. So, and here's March 2nd, and look at that. That's what we got. We have a 5% starting charge at the next day, very close to that 4%. And we get to see the system really work the data now. So now it's starting the day at 5%. Okay, and it knows that because the weather report showed 95% cloud cover, that our contribution is expected to be in that 10 to 20 kilowatt hour range. And we have a goal of 20% to make it through the evening, but the confidence that we're actually going to get to that 20% is not really high. And so if we're the system, what do? Well, we need to get to 20%, so we set the reserve to 20%. And then the result of that is that the system will draw from the grid power to try and, well, it'll feed the house with the grid power, and then it'll try and convert every bit of solar power that we have into the battery, and then it will try and reach that 20% goal for the day. Well, unfortunately, we wound up ending our total solar day at 9%, even with that reserve set and putting all the power away. Well, now what? Well, 9% isn't enough to get us through the entire evening to the next day, but it is enough to give us that little bit of security blanket if we leave the system at 20% reserve until late in the evening, and then estimate how long the system will run on that 9% power. In other words, you know, what would get us to the beginning of our next day of contribution? Would we, you know, switch the system on at midnight, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning? Where would we engage that so that then we would make it? And so at that point, the system, whether, you know, was midnight or 1 in the morning, then the system would go back to a 0% reserve and deplete it prior to the contribution on March 3rd. The other alternative would be just to leave the reserve set high and then have the system power itself off of the grid power, and then morning would come and we would still have that 9% in reserve. So if we're the AI, what do? We would message the human, and we would ask them what they want us to do. I think that would be the appropriate thing. And so here again we have March 2nd, right? And so the owner then decides to deplete it. That's what I decided to do. The weather wasn't predicted to be terribly severe, and so I decided, well, to try and minimize the amount of power that we're using off of the grid, let's go ahead and wind up with a situation in the morning where we were completely depleted and then would take a charge. And so that's what we did. I wouldn't fault the system had it chosen to stay at a reserve of 20%. And in fact, that would probably be and should probably be the default of the system if the human interaction, if the owner doesn't say, yeah, go ahead and deplete. And so then this brings us to the 3rd of March. And we had told the system to go to 0% around midnight. It did. And the result of that is that we started the next day at 0%. And part of the reason, part of the rationale for doing that is that the next day was 72% predicted cloud cover. And so that gave us an expectation of production of between 25 and 37 kilowatt hours. And so what actually happened? Well, what you can see here is started the day at 0%, and we have a problem. Though we predicted a minimum of 25% production, it doesn't always go as planned. And so we only got 20.8. But at what point then did the system realize, ooh, we're maybe not going to make this? And so let's pull up the grid usage for both the 2nd and the 3rd. There we go. And so as you see on the 2nd, we had set our reserve to that 20% around 9 a.m. and then set the reserve to 0 at about 11:30 p.m. All right. And then on the evening of the 2nd, you can see where we left the system on 20% reserve. All right. 11:30 comes around. Then it went to self-powered mode at 0% reserve. And then on the morning of the 3rd, we were able to run until about 6 a.m. before the battery had gotten to that fully depleted point, at which point it ran off of grid power again until the solar contribution came on and started to match the home usage around 8 a.m. And so then pull up that March 3rd again. Monitoring the system closely, it became apparent around noon that we weren't going to make our total solar day percentage without some help. And so at noon, the system was set again to 20% in hopes that we'd be able to reach that mark. And by the end of the total solar day, we'd managed to make it to 18%. And then at that point, the system reserve was set back to 0 so that it would run off of that, that power. And again, that's that decision point. If we were the AI, what would we do? Well, we would message the owner of the system and say, this is our situation, what do you want to do? And in a fail-safe situation, the system might leave itself at that 20%, or put it to a 10% reserve. That might be also a choice that the system would make, a safe choice, good choice. And so then that brings us to the fourth. Well, even though we didn't quite make it to our 20%, you can see that 18% left us with 5% at the time of first solar contribution. And so what caused that that slightly less reduction during the evening? I'm not quite sure, but it is what it is. And so because of that, the system was again told to shift back to its 20% or 0% goal, 0% charge to deplete. Well, so now here we have an interesting situation here. Remember back our forecast. Let's pull up our forecast here real quick. So because we were expecting rainy weather on the 5th and 6th, making it to 20% or more is going to be really critical for the 4th. And in fact, what we need to do is we need to then pad the following day to make up for what our loss is going to be, what our difference between our usage and what we create is going to be. And so because we've got some extra power to put in there, we might as well set our reserve higher. And so in this particular case, on the 4th, what you see is that we set the reserve to 35%. And again, based on the forecast that we have, and so we're estimating the overage should be around 15% to cover the forecast for the 5th. And so then the reserve is set, here, I should pull that up. Reserve was set at 10:30 a.m. The reserve was set to 35% instead of 20%. And so here's the energy use. And as you can see, the system reached 35% just before the end of the total solar day contribution. And then the system went back to a reserve of 0% to start running the home. I did that around 5:11. And so here's the sequence in order. This is 10:30 in the morning when the system was set to 35%, and this shows around 5:10 or so when it actually met the reserve that we'd set. And then following that, we set the system to 0% reserve. And then the result of that was what you saw here, which is that energy use for the day. And so now we'll go ahead and pull up the 5th. Was it enough? Well, the system starts off at 12%, but we know we're going to have some pretty nasty weather. And so the likelihood that we're going to make it to that 20% is relatively low. So then what do? Well, we set it back to a 20% reserve and see if we'll make it. And as you can see by looking at the data for the 5th here, by 4 p.m. the solar contribution was pretty much done, and that left us with a total solar day of 15%, about 5% shy of what we would have liked to have seen. We'd done the same thing the previous day and set the reserve to 0, and the system went back on self-powered mode. And so again, that's what we have here. And so now if we follow this, you'll see that by 9:30 p.m. the system was down to 9% in the evening. Let me see what I can do here. We'll pull, yeah, what have we got here? So here, let me pull this up. So by 9:30 p.m. The system was running about 9%, and again the weather predicted for the following day was fairly nasty, and so the reserve was set back up to 20% to preserve that 9% in the case of a power outage either that evening or the following day before solar contribution really picked up. And again, that's kind of into that safety mode. What are we expecting the AI to do as those days progress? At some point it's going to make a decision, oh, you know, for safety I need to then automatically set this reserve. These are some of the things that we would like the systems to be able to do on their own, maybe with a notification, maybe not. And so then what do we got here? So then we'll pull up the 6th. So now the 6th starts us off with 20% reserve running the entire home from grid power. And here's where it can get kind of you know, a little confusing if it's not been confusing already. So I'll try and step by the logic here as best I can. So at 7:10 the system begins its self-powered mode again with the reserve at 0% to limit as much as possible the amount of power that's used from the grid. The solar production wasn't great at this time because again we're talking about those shoulder periods, right? And so early in the morning and late in the evening you don't have as much solar production early on, and so it's more advantageous at those times to run off of battery power until the solar contribution starts to match the home. Here's that power usage in the morning where we're showing it come off of the battery. All right, and so then again to optimize that we wait until 9:12 in the morning when the system began producing more than the home was using. Then it's to your advantage to then go ahead and set the system back to that reserve, and now you're going to get the most bang for your buck coming off of the total solar production. And so then the result of that grid use for the 6th was this. And so we used 7.2 kilowatt hours for the 6th, and that shows how that usage, grid usage, was minimized by the clever flipping back and forth we did. The result was that the system reached about 20% around 3 p.m. and continued to both charge the batteries and run the home until the end of total solar day at 5:35 p.m. and that left us with a 28% total charge in the battery. And so then now we're on the 7th, and so ending the total day on the 6th with 28%. Our evening usage was a little bit lower than usual. We started the 7th with 12% system charge, and again, like we discussed before, some of that stretch, some of the reason why we're consuming or seem to be consuming less battery power in the evening is due to those lengthening days. There's some other factors too that I haven't quite figured out, but this here is an example of how the shortening days are increasing what we start with on the following days. And so yeah, because the days are getting longer and nights are shortening, and so that affects our forecast for the year. So our forecast for the 7th was 59% cloud cover with expected yield of somewhere between 25 and 37 kilowatt hours. And so starting with 12%, there's no reason for the system to assume that the goal of 20% won't be met. So it just continues on its self-powered mode with the reserve set to 0. And ending the day at 25%. The daily production of 20.1 kilowatt hours is a little bit shy of prediction, but you know, pretty much right in there. And so the following day is predicted to be 42% cloud cover. Again, another yield of 25 to 37 kilowatt hours of production, so the system can remain at 0%. Again, we're above that that 20% mark, and so we'll make it to the next day. And then that brings us to the closeout on the 8th, and starting the day at 5%. And we've got a high production for our expectation, and so we'll pick it up there next week. And so, with us playing the part of the system, I think we, pretty clearly we did pretty well. We did pretty clean. The biggest concern, obviously, are those areas where the system does not or should not make its own decisions. And so, that being, that where a decision has to be made for economy versus safety. And so I think it's pretty clear that we're better off to err on the side of caution. There's certainly, so you use a little bit more power, the system would better to make the error in that direction than to risk a power failure in a storm just because you were trying to be frugal and wring every last dime out of the system. And it's probably healthier for the system as well. We covered that even though there's that built-in reserve on the battery so that they don't fully deplete, you still would like to keep the system topped off a little bit higher and work that. And we'll discuss that later as we start to go into the summer months, where we start to maybe make those decisions to turn off a few of the batteries if we don't need them, and then force the majority of the rest of the system to operate higher instead of running the risk of having those things nearly fully charged all the time. So we'll kind of go with that as we come across it. But that's it for this week. I hope you guys found that kind of interesting to go through some of this stuff step by step. You can see what a pain in the butt it will be to work out algorithms and machine learning that actually takes all of this stuff into account, so that eventually these systems will be smarter and require less manual alterations of the system just to keep them in an economical mode for the consumer. So if you like this, feel free to like and subscribe. We'll keep them coming to you. I apologize that this got out so late. There's been a lot of things going on with Venezuela that I've been trying to follow closely, and so we're going to go ahead and produce a quick topic on that as I close out. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.